What if the image of Jesus you've carried all your life was missing pieces? Not a falsehood, but a puzzle with crucial parts removed. Imagine leafing through a sacred manuscript under the dim glow of an oil lamp, the parchment warm under your fingers, and realizing that the story you thought you knew had entire chapters erased. For centuries, these missing lines were not buried in locked vaults, but hidden in plain sight, woven between official verses, shaped by the hands of power and politics. Why would any institution risk rewriting the memory of a man from a small town in Galilee? History offers an unsettling answer. When belief shapes nations, the story becomes a throne, and the one who guards it rules more than hearts. Before we go further, take a moment to subscribe to this channel, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments as we go. That way, we can explore these buried truths together and keep them from disappearing again. In 1945, a farmer in Nag Hammadi, Egypt, cracked open a sealed jar in the desert and found ancient scrolls unlike anything the Sunday pulpit ever spoke of. Among them, a gospel where Jesus performs no miracles, dies no death, and rises from no tomb, yet speaks with a voice that pierces deeper than ritual. If you draw out what is within you, it declares, it will save you. A teaching not about bowing to distant authority, but about turning inward to find the kingdom already alive within. Ask yourself, what happens when people stop believing that sacred truth belongs only to priests, councils, or temples? Records reveal there were dozens of such writings in the first centuries after Jesus, each offering a different lens. Some portraying him as a sage, others as a revealer of hidden knowledge. The official Bible we hold today contains only 4 narratives. The rest were burned, banned, or labeled dangerous. But dangerous to whom? To those seeking God, or to those seeking control? Picture the council chambers of the 4th century. Torches flickering, scribes hunched over ink-stained tables, and a decision being inked into permanence. Certain books are blessed, others are condemned. In that moment, entire visions of Jesus vanish from public life. What remained was a single portrait, tidy, controllable, useful to empire. Here's a personal observation. When truth threatens to free people from dependence, it is often recast as heresy. And heresy in the hands of power becomes a tool to erase memory. The banned Gospels did more than contradict events. They challenged the very structure of faith. They taught that the divine spark rests in each soul, that no human mediator is required, and that heaven is not a distant realm but a reality unfolding now. And so the question lingers like smoke in an empty hall. If these words had been preserved in full, how differently might the world see not only Jesus, but themselves? What follows will take us into the heart of those suppressed pages, where the voice of a first-century teacher still waits to be heard, unfiltered, unchained, and dangerously alive. Part 1: What was hidden and why? The version of Jesus most people know comes from 4 books: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These became the official record. They tell a single continuous story: a birth foretold, miracles performed, a death on a cross, and a resurrection 3 days later. For centuries, this has been the central portrait. But the early years of Christianity were not so simple. In the first few hundred years after Jesus' death, believers didn't have a single, fixed set of scriptures. Instead, there were dozens of Gospels in circulation. Some matched the tone of the 4 we know. Others were strikingly different. So different, in fact, that they could have led the Christian faith down another path entirely. One of the most startling discoveries came not from a library, but from the Egyptian desert. In 1945, a farmer near Nag Hammadi dug into the earth and unearthed a sealed clay jar. Inside, wrapped in layers of linen, were leather-bound codices, ancient manuscripts that had been hidden for over 1,500 years. Among them was a text now known as the Gospel of Thomas. Unlike the familiar Gospels, it told no stories of water turning to wine, of storms stilled by a word, or of bodies rising from tombs. There was no virgin birth, no crucifixion, no resurrection. Instead, it was a series of sayings, short, sharp, sometimes cryptic, that painted Jesus not as a miracle worker to be worshipped from afar, but as a master teacher pointing each person back to themselves. One of its most quoted lines reads, "If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not, it will destroy you." The meaning is simple, yet unsettling. The truth that matters most is already inside you. Ignore it, and you risk losing yourself entirely. I can't help noticing that such a message shifts the center of gravity. If salvation is about awakening what's within, then the power rests in the individual, not in an institution, not in a temple, not even in a book. The Gospel of Thomas wasn't alone. Other writings, like the Gospel of Mary Magdalene and the Gospel of Philip, carried similar themes. They portrayed faith as an inner transformation rather than obedience to an external authority. Mary's Gospel, for example, presents her as a close and trusted disciple, one who grasped Jesus' teaching more deeply than others. That kind of portrayal challenged the male-dominated leadership of the early church. Ask yourself, if these voices had been preserved, how differently would the story of Christian faith sound today? By the 4th century, the scattered communities of believers were being drawn into the orbit of imperial power. Under Emperor Constantine, Christianity shifted from an outlawed movement to the official religion of the Roman Empire. With that shift came a need for unity, stability, and control. In 325 AD, church leaders gathered at the Council of Nicaea. This wasn't just a meeting about theology. It was a political moment, a decision about which version of Jesus would serve as the foundation for a religion tied to empire. Gospels that didn't fit the emerging standard, ones that spoke of inner authority, personal awakening, or equality among disciples, were labeled heretical and banned from use. Those outside the approved canon were often called Gnostic, from the Greek gnosis, meaning inner knowledge. Contrary to how later critics portrayed them, Gnostics were not wild pagans inventing myths for their own gain. They were seekers, men and women convinced that the divine spark lived in every person waiting to be recognized. Their belief was radical. Salvation wasn't a transaction or a ritual. It was the moment you woke to the reality that you and God were not separate. In their eyes, Jesus was the awakener, someone who held up a mirror so others could see their true nature. Imagine for a moment what it would mean for the average believer to hear that heaven was not a far-off realm, but something already within reach. That the kingdom wasn't locked away behind altars or reserved for a chosen few, but spread across the earth for those with eyes to see. That idea threatened more than theology. It threatened the very structure that kept the church, and by extension the empire, in control. If people saw themselves as direct bearers of divine light, what need would there be for layers of hierarchy, for mediators, for rituals that required institutional oversight? This is why those other gospels, and the communities that cherished them, were pushed to the margins. Over time, many were lost to decay or deliberately destroyed. What survived did so by chance, or by the determination of those who believed some truths were too precious to surrender. And yet, even in the darkness of suppression, the words from those forbidden pages still carry a strange, steady light. They remind us that the Jesus of history was not always the Jesus of empire, and that his voice might sound different if heard outside the walls built around it. In the next part, we'll step deeper into that shadowed space, to see how politics, power, and the fear of losing control shaped the version of the gospel the world was allowed to hear. Part 2: Suppression and Survival of the Forbidden Gospel, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, stands like a whisper from the past, a voice that almost didn't survive. In its pages, Mary is not a marginal figure standing quietly in the shadows. She is a confidant, a disciple who grasps the heart of Jesus' teaching with a clarity that outshines the others. She speaks with conviction, she counsels the fearful, and perhaps most dangerous of all, she is portrayed as the one who truly understands. For a movement already leaning toward male leadership, such a vision was disruptive. It hinted at a different center of gravity, one where authority rested not in the hands of a few, but in anyone who had awakened to the truth. Could the early church, already grappling with unity, have survived if this idea had spread unchecked? Many of these texts were quietly set aside or publicly denounced. The reason was not always theological. It was often about preserving a system. To admit women as spiritual equals, to say they could lead or teach on the same level, threatened the fragile order the church was building. Doctrine was one thing, hierarchy was another, yet the ideas refused to die. In the arid silence of the Egyptian desert, hermits and mystics carried fragments of this forbidden vision. Known as the Desert Fathers, and in some cases Desert Mothers, they retreated far from the cities, seeking God without the interference of councils or courts. By the flickering light of oil lamps, they copied sayings and meditated on the spark they believed lived in every soul. The dry wind outside their stone cells parried dust, but also a strange kind of freedom. Centuries later, in medieval Europe, figures like Meister Eckhart would echo that same conviction. He preached that within every person lies a divine spark, uncreated, eternal, waiting to be recognized. His sermons drew crowds, but also suspicion. Church authorities accused him of heresy, fearing that his words might lead people to bypass the institution entirely. What would happen if the farmer, the merchant, or the peasant believed they needed no priest to meet God? The threat to the established order became more visible in the 12th century with the rise of the Cathars in southern France. They preached a dual vision of reality: a world of light pure and unchanging, and a world of shadow, the material realm, flawed and corrupt, shaped by a lesser power they called the demiurge. They rejected the authority of Rome. They allowed women to serve as spiritual leaders. They refused to take oaths or bear arms. One chronicler records how their meetings often took place in simple homes, lit by nothing more than a single candle on a wooden table. The smell of freshly baked bread mingled with the scent of herbs, while voices rose in quiet prayer. For them, the church was not a building but a fellowship of the awakened. To Pope Innocent III, this was intolerable. In 1209 he launched a crusade to eradicate them. The siege of Béziers ended in slaughter. The infamous command, "Kill them all. God will know his own," still chills the blood. Whole communities were wiped out. Their writings were burned. But the ideas could not be so easily destroyed. Hidden in the symbols of cathedral stonework, in the geometry of rose windows, in the allegories of alchemy and hermetic texts, fragments of that inner gospel continued to breathe. They moved quietly, passed through the hands of artisans, scholars, and mystics. Centuries later, Carl Jung would look at the surviving Gnostic writings and call their authors the first depth psychologists, seekers mapping the inner landscape of the soul long before the term existed. Ask yourself, if a truth must hide to survive, does it lose its light, or does the secrecy make it burn brighter? From Mary's bold voice to the Cathar's defiance, from the lonely desert cells to the coded symbols in stone, the forbidden gospel was never entirely silenced. It simply learned to speak in whispers, in symbols, in dreams. And in those whispers lies a challenge: to hear a voice the empire tried to erase, and to wonder what else in history was buried not because it was false, but because it was too true to be allowed. In the next part, we will follow that voice into the corridors of power, to see how political ambition, fear, and the shaping of orthodoxy locked the gates around the faith the world came to know. Part 3: Core Teachings of the Forbidden Gospel. The Gospels, pushed to the margins, carry a thread of teaching so simple, yet so unsettling, that it could unravel the entire fabric of institutional religion. They speak of the kingdom of God not as a distant reward, but as something already here, a reality beneath the surface of the everyday, waiting to be seen. To those who heard it fresh, this was not poetry, it was an invitation. Imagine being told that heaven was not locked away behind the gates of death, but available in this very breath, that it was not a location on a cosmic map, but a shift in perception. How differently would you live if you believed the gates were already open? These forbidden texts point to an inner spark, a fragment of divine intelligence planted in each person. It does not need to be earned. It cannot be given by another. It is already yours, like an ember glowing under ash, waiting for the smallest breath to awaken it. The act of redemption in this vision is not appeasing an offended deity. It is remembering where you came from. That memory is dangerous to anyone who thrives on fear. If you know that your essence is divine, threats of hell lose their grip. The need for a mediator between you and God begins to dissolve, and with it, the structures built on that dependence. Ancient mystics across cultures seem to glimpse the same truth. In the Jewish mystical tradition, the Kabbalah's tree of life describes the ascent of the soul through stages of awareness, each one drawing closer to the infinite source. In the Hermetic writings, the maxim appears again and again: as within, so without; as above, so below. The world around you reflects the world within you, and the path to transformation runs in both directions. The Gnostic myth of Sophia carries the teaching in story form. Sophia, a figure of divine wisdom, descends from the fullness of the spiritual realm into the shadowed depths of material existence. She becomes entangled in its illusions, forgetting her origin. Yet the longing for the source never fades. Her journey is not about acquiring something new, but about waking to what she always was, and returning to the fullness she had never truly left. One account tells of initiates gathering in a candlelit room, the flame casting long shadows on the stone walls. A teacher speaks slowly, each word measured, each pause deliberate. The air is warm, heavy with the smell of burning oil. As the students listen, they are not being given answers. They are being asked to remember. The parallels are striking. Whether in a Hebrew mystic's diagrams, a Hermetic philosopher's aphorism, or a Gnostic parable, the same current flows. The divine is not elsewhere, it is here, and to live from that awareness is to be free. But freedom has a cost. Without the fear of punishment, people begin to ask different questions. Without the need for permission, they make different choices. And without the weight of imposed guilt, they can no longer be steered by the same levers. Is it any wonder that such teachings were buried? From a modern perspective, one could see these ideas as early explorations of consciousness. Not unlike what psychologists and neuroscientists study today, Carl Jung noted that the Gnostics were, in a sense, the first depth psychologists. They mapped the inner landscape long before science had the language for it. Yet this is not only an ancient curiosity. It poses a living challenge. If the kingdom is now, if the divine spark is within, then what excuse remains for ignoring it? And if that awareness spreads, what becomes of the powers built on our forgetfulness? The forbidden gospel does not beg to be believed. It dares you to see for yourself. And that is why it still feels dangerous. It bypasses the outer walls and speaks to the inner citadel, where no decree of emperor or edict of council can reach. In the next part, we will see how the echoes of this message have survived, hidden in plain sight, and how even now they continue to challenge the stories we have been told. Part 4: Transformation and Resistance. The old cathedrals were built to inspire awe, and to keep watch. Their vaulted ceilings drew the gaze upward, toward painted heavens, while their shadowed corners whispered of the flames below. Architecture became theology in stone, a place where you could feel both lifted toward salvation and pressed down by the fear of falling. For centuries, fear was the quiet companion of faith, not the reverent awe that opens the heart, but the heavy dread that chained the soul. Sin was a debt you could never fully repay. Hell was not a metaphor but an ever-present threat, its imagery etched into sermons, art, and the hushed warnings of the devout. To question was dangerous. To trust your own inner prompting was to risk listening to the wrong voice, perhaps even the devil's whisper. And yet, beneath all of this, something stubborn persisted. The hunger for direct encounter, the longing for a presence not mediated by altar or priest, but felt in the quiet chambers of the soul. By the 4th century, and in the long stretch that followed, this hunger took shape in individuals who dared to seek without permission. What they discovered was not a distant God dispensing approval, but a living current already moving within them. The Gnostics had called it the spark. Later mystics described it as a well of light that, once uncovered, needed no keeper. I think of a woman named Marguerite Perret, a French beguine in the early 1300s. She wrote of the annihilated soul that no longer strives for merit because it rests wholly in God's love. Her book was burned. She was burned with it. Why? Because a soul that knows it stands already in the divine presence cannot be governed by fear, and fear was the mortar holding the great religious structures together. So here is the first question. If the threat of punishment vanished overnight, how much of organized religion as we know it would remain standing? The path of awakening described in these forbidden and mystical streams was not a gentle stroll. It began with seeking, an ache for something more than ritual, a thirst that no recited creed could quench. Then came the troubling stage, when old beliefs cracked under the weight of lived experience. This was a painful season. The cold stone of inherited doctrine often clashed with the warm pulse of personal revelation. For those who pressed through, there came a marveling. To see the divine not as an external monarch but as the very breath in your lungs was both dizzying and grounding. The light wasn't out there. It was here, always had been. But the journey didn't stop at insight. It required what some called the death of the false self, the stripping away of ego's masks, the crucifixion of the persona we thought was me. In its place rose something quieter yet stronger, the self rooted in God, immune to both flattery and threat. Imagine the challenge this posed to the medieval church. An awakened soul had no need for elaborate systems of penance, no terror of damnation to keep them compliant. The hierarchy's power depended on being the exclusive broker of grace. Remove the fear and the broker loses leverage. One monastic record tells of a hermit who, after years in the desert, returned to the city and moved through the crowded market as if the world were a cathedral. He blessed the beggar, the merchant, and the thief with the same serene gaze. People whispered that he saw something in each face. That is the unsettling effect of true gnosis. It refuses to categorize. Here's the second question. If every person you met carried a fragment of the divine, how would it change the way you speak, work, and even argue? In the language of the mystics, awakening was not an accomplishment but a homecoming. It didn't make one better than others. It stripped away the illusion of separation. From that vantage point, love flowed naturally, not as a moral duty but as the only thing that made sense. I once read the notes of a 15th century anchoress who described prayer as leaning into the light until the shadows fall away. That image stays with me, not as poetry but as something tactile. I can almost feel the faint warmth on my cheek, the way a beam of morning sun cuts through a narrow window. Such moments needed no sermon. They carried their own authority. In time, these inner awakenings birthed quiet resistance. Not with rebellion in the streets, but with lives that refused to bow to fear. They did not leave their faith, they reclaimed it from within, and in doing so, they threatened every structure built on control rather than communion. This is the paradox that echoes through history. The more tightly institutions clutched their power, the more the hidden fire spread beyond their grasp. And in the next part, we will see how that fire leapt from cloistered hearts into art, philosophy, and movements that reshaped the world. Sometimes in plain sight, sometimes in code, always refusing to die. Part 5: The Ultimate Truth. They had built statues, painted icons, and written creeds about him. But what if Christ was never meant to be trapped in a single historical figure? What if Christ was not a surname at all, but a living state of awareness, available to anyone who dared to wake up? The earliest followers of Jesus before the councils and empires seemed to sense this. In fragments of old texts he is recorded saying, "You will do greater works than these," not as a poet's flourish, but as a challenge. The light you see in me, you must see in yourself. Pause for a moment. If you believed that statement without compromise, how would it change the way you live tomorrow morning? The Christ state was not about robes, titles, or anointing oil. It was about living with unshakable clarity, a love that included even those who cursed you, and an awareness so rooted in the source that fear itself lost its grip. In this vision, to become Christed was not to join an exclusive club, it was to let that same radiance take up residence inside your own life. One example survives in the story of an Egyptian desert elder named Abba Joseph. When a younger monk asked what it meant to follow Christ fully, Joseph rose, stretched out his hands, and fire leapt from his fingers. "If you will," he said, "you can become all flame." The moment was not about magic. It was about the visible, almost scorching heat of someone consumed by divine awareness. The Church Fathers understood the danger. A faith built on a living inner resurrection would not bow to hierarchy. If Christ could be born in any heart, the gatekeepers were out of a job. Authority based on mediating between man and God would crumble. In many suppressed traditions, resurrection was not about a tomb in Jerusalem. It was about the death of the false self. The ego, with all its grasping and fear, was the real corpse to be buried. The new life was not a promise for the afterworld, but an inner transformation so total that the person you once were could not be found. This was not abstract philosophy. It carried real social danger. The population, convinced that they carried the same divine spark as the saints and prophets, could not be controlled by threats of hell or denial of sacraments. Such people stood upright, answered to the truth in their own conscience, and loved their neighbor without being told whom to love. And yet, this vision keeps resurfacing. Mystics across centuries, Hildegard of Bingen in the West, Simeon the new theologian in the East, spoke of light filling the soul until it overflowed into every thought and gesture. You can almost hear it in their language. Not distant hope, but present reality. The question presses in. If this is true, why do so many prefer to keep Christ locked in history rather than alive in themselves? Part of the answer is fear. True divine awareness is unpredictable. It refuses to be managed, and it exposes every false comfort. It calls the banker to love the beggar, the ruler to wash the prisoner's feet, the believer to forgive without conditions. For those in power, this kind of awakening is more threatening than heresy. It is a revolution without an army. Even in art and architecture, this undercurrent survived. Certain cathedral rose windows seem almost designed to suggest the soul's opening into light. In some, the central figure of Christ is mirrored by 12 radiating panels, like the same pattern repeating itself outward, hinting that the center could exist in every human heart. If you stand in one of those cathedrals at noon, when the sun hits the glass, the air itself seems to change temperature. The light grows warm against your skin, as if the building is quietly insisting that the divine is not above you, but already around and within you. From this angle, the ultimate truth is simple, but not safe. The Christ was never a monopoly. His intention was to awaken many, not to be worshipped as an unreachable exception. Love was not his trademark, it was his invitation. To embrace this is to step into the same current he walked in. To see with his eyes, forgive with his heart, and live as though heaven is already spilling into earth. It is not about waiting for a kingdom, it is about being the kingdom. And perhaps that is the most subversive part of all. If the real resurrection happens within, no institution can lock its doors against it. No law can outlaw it. No empire can claim it as property. This is why the truth had to be buried under centuries of doctrine. Because if every man and woman knew they could stand in the same light, the old structures would fall, not by rebellion, but by becoming unnecessary. In the next part, we will follow this dangerous idea into the present day, to see how it still flickers in unexpected places, and why some are willing to risk everything to keep it alive. Part 6 echoes through the ages. In a dim archive room, the only light comes from a single brass lamp, its glow spilling over a table where a scholar leans close to a fragment of ancient parchment. The air smells faintly of dry leather and the dust of faraway deserts. With gloved hands, they turn a page that hasn't been touched in centuries. The words, faded but still legible, seem almost to breathe. It's easy to think the forbidden gospel was buried and forgotten. Yet like underground rivers, its ideas have surfaced again and again, never in the same form, never in the same place, but always carrying that same pulse. The divine is near, within now. We catch glimpses in unexpected corners of history, in the poetry of Rumi, where the beloved is found in the depths of the heart, in the brushstrokes of Leonardo, where sacred geometry whispers of unity, in the writings of Carl Jung, who saw in the old Gnostic myths a mirror of the human psyche. Even today, fragments of Thomas's sayings slip into modern culture. A film character murmurs, "The kingdom is within you." A popular song hints that light lives in every soul. Most never know these are echoes from a gospel once hunted by fire. But here's the question. If such words still find us after nearly 2 millennia, are they simply coincidences? Or are they seeds waiting for the right soil? New discoveries keep shifting the ground. Archaeologists unearth sealed jars from forgotten monasteries. Digital imaging reveals layers of text beneath medieval overwriting. Machine translation lets us hear voices once silenced by language and geography. It's as if the past is leaning forward, whispering to the present. I've noticed something. In an age drowning in noise, more and more people are drawn to the quiet center these texts describe. The hunger isn't for more rules. It's for a way to stand in the storm without being swept away. Maybe that's why the light within resonates now as it did then. Consider the scene in 1945 when that farmer in Nag Hammadi first broke the clay seal. The manuscripts inside had been hidden for over 1,500 years. What did it feel like in that moment? The brittle crack of pottery, the faint scent of sand trapped since the Roman Empire, the weight of leather-bound pages in his hands. He couldn't have known he was holding a truth banned by emperors and bishops alike. And here's the harder question. If this truth were fully understood today, that the kingdom is not a distant realm but the living ground of our being, would it dismantle more than just old theology? Could it upend the power structures that depend on fear and division? Throughout history, those who carried these ideas often paid the price. They were branded heretics, driven into deserts, burned with their books. Yet the flame never quite went out. It hid in symbols carved into cathedral stone. It passed through secret lines of teachers and healers. It re-emerged in mystical movements the authorities couldn't fully suppress. Perhaps that's the lesson the forbidden gospel teaches by its own survival. Truth has its own persistence. You can ban the book, but you can't silence the heartbeat behind it. Today, the tools of suppression have changed. It's no longer about burning manuscripts. It's about burying ideas under an avalanche of distractions. But the danger to control remains the same. Once a person sees that they are already standing in the light, no threat can make them kneel. And maybe that is the thread connecting the deserts of Egypt to our crowded digital world. Both are places where the rarest treasure is not gold or oil or data, it's clarity. So we stand at a strange crossroads. The Gospels chosen by empire still shape much of the faith known today. But just beneath the surface, the suppressed voices hum with a different note. One that says you are not empty, you are not separate, you are not powerless. The question is no longer whether these words will survive. The question is whether we will have the courage to hear them. Because perhaps the most unsettling truth for power is not that people might lose their religion, it's that they might discover they never needed permission to touch the divine. And that's where the trail leads us next, into the final reckoning where we must ask, if this forbidden light is real, what would it mean for a world built on the shadows? Conclusion: when the forbidden gospel becomes your own, they tried to seal the words. They tried to bury the fire, but the current of truth has always found a way through, slipping past walls, living in whispers, burning in those who dared to remember. The hidden gospel's core is not a relic of the past. It is a living challenge to every chain still disguised as holy. The heart of its message is simple, yet unstoppable. The light of God is already within. No decree can give it, no priest can own it, and once you see it for yourself, no fear can take it away. This is why the suppression was so fierce, not because the message was weak, but because it was too strong to control. Think of the long arc of history we've traced, from scrolls sealed in clay jars to teachings whispered in the deserts, from the courage of those branded heretics to the quiet endurance of mystics. The same river flows. It is the river of direct knowing. It asks no permission to speak to your soul. In the end, the forbidden gospel does not give you a new set of walls. It hands you a key. It dares you to step outside the house built for you and see the horizon for yourself. And when you do, you may find that the kingdom of God was never locked at all. It was hidden in the one place no institution could search. The living depths of your own being. Here is the twist. The very thing meant to keep you small, fear, can be the trailhead of awakening. When you turn toward it instead of away, you discover that what you feared was never greater than what you already carry. So here's what to do next. Take one step this week toward that inner light. Not a step into someone else's system, but into your own awareness, whether in silence, in study, or in honest questioning. See what rises. Share that journey. That's the main action. The second, if this exploration matters to you, hit subscribe and turn on the playlist we've linked. This is just one thread in a much larger tapestry, and I'd like to walk that road together. Now I want to hear from you. If all the layers of tradition and interpretation fell away, and you met the words of Jesus as if for the first time, what do you think you would hear? Would it sound like the same gospel you've been told, or something far wilder, far freer? Until next time, stay awake, stay unafraid, and guard the light within.